The Ardennes is old forest, not ancient in the way of primordial wilderness, but old enough to have accumulated history in its soil. Roman roads buried beneath the leaf litter, medieval trails long overgrown, the scars of previous wars smoothed over by decades of growth. The forest stretches across southeastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, a rolling landscape of dense oak and beech stands cut through by narrow river valleys and steep-sided ridges. In winter, the canopy closes overhead, and the light that reaches the forest floor is gray and diffuse, filtered through bare branches that creak in the wind. By December 1944, the Ardennes had become what the Allied command called a quiet sector. The front line ran through it, but the terrain was considered unsuitable for major operations. The forests were too thick for armor. The roads were too narrow and poorly maintained. The American units holding the line, primarily elements of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, along with scattered reconnaissance and engineering units, were spread thin across an 80-mile front. Many were green, fresh from training camps in the States, seeing combat for the first time. Others were veteran units pulled back from the fighting farther north, resting and refitting after the brutal autumn campaigns. The sector was cold. Temperatures had dropped below freezing in early December and remained there. Snow fell intermittently, accumulating in patches beneath the trees, turning the dirt roads to frozen mud. The men lived in foxholes and log-reinforced dugouts, wrapped in wool blankets and whatever extra clothing they could scavenge. Hot food came up irregularly. Ammunition was adequate, but not abundant. The war seemed distant here, muffled by the trees and the snow and the peculiar silence that settles over forests in winter. But the locals knew better. The Ardennes has stories. The farmers and woodcutters who lived in the scattered villages along the forest's edge spoke of things that walked the old trails when the nights were long and the moon was dark. They spoke of lights seen between the trees, moving without sound, without source. They spoke of travelers who entered the forest and did not return, or who returned days later with no memory of where they had been. The stories were old, older than the wars, older than the villages themselves. Most dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales that accumulated in isolated places where winters were hard and evenings were long. But some of the stories were more specific. They spoke of a figure, a man or something shaped like a man, who carried a lantern through the forest. The lantern burned with a light that was neither fire nor electric, a pale glow that could be seen from a great distance but illuminated nothing. The figure appeared before battles, the stories said, before disasters, before death. It walked the trails that armies would march, days or weeks before the soldiers arrived. And those who saw it, those who followed the light, were never seen again. The Americans had heard fragments of these stories from the Belgian civilians who remained in the area. Most soldiers laughed them off. Superstition, peasant tales. But a few of the older non-coms, men who had fought in North Africa or Italy, men who had seen enough to know that the world contained things that defied easy explanation, told the younger soldiers to stay out of the forest at night. They said the Ardennes was different. They said it had a weight to it, a presence, and that men who wandered off alone sometimes did not come back. On the night of December 15th, a reconnaissance patrol from the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Division, was sent into the forest near the village of Losheim. The patrol consisted of 8 men under the command of Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, a 31-year-old from Pennsylvania who had been with the division since its activation in 1942. The mission was routine. Move east along a logging trail, check for German patrols or defensive positions, and return before dawn. The patrol left their lines at 2100 hours. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the temperature near 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The men moved in single file, spacing themselves 10 yards apart, weapons ready. The forest was silent except for the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional crack of a branch in the cold. No moon, no wind, just darkness and the faint gray shapes of trees against the sky. At 22:30 hours, the patrol reported their position by radio. They were approximately 3 miles east of the American lines, moving along the trail as planned. No contact, no enemy activity. Sergeant Brennan said they would proceed another mile, then turn back. At 23:15 hours, the patrol's radio operator, Corporal Raymond Howell, transmitted a brief message. "We see a light, moving north to south, approximately 400 yards ahead, investigating." That was the last transmission. The patrol failed to return by dawn. A search party was organized and sent out at first light on the 16th. They followed the trail the patrol had taken, moving cautiously, weapons at the ready. The forest was quiet. No signs of combat, no shell craters, no bullet impacts, no blood. But 3 miles east of the American lines, near a bend in the logging trail where the trees grew dense and the undergrowth formed a tangled wall, they found something. A single boot print in the snow, then another. The prints led off the trail, heading south into the thickest part of the forest. The search party followed for half a mile, moving slowly, scanning the trees. The prints continued, evenly spaced, purposeful. Then they stopped. Not at a clearing, not at an obstacle. They simply ended, mid-stride, as if the man who had made them had ceased to exist. The search party called for reinforcements. By midday, 2 full platoons were combing the area. They found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of the missing patrol. The 8 men had vanished. That evening, the German offensive began. At 05:30 hours on December 16th, over 200,000 German troops supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns launched a massive attack along the Ardennes front. The offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, struck directly at the thinly held American lines. Within hours, the 99th and 106th Divisions were fighting for survival. Communications broke down. Units were cut off. The front collapsed. And in the chaos of the first day, as American soldiers fought and died in the frozen forests, more than a dozen men reported seeing the same thing. A light moving through the trees. A pale, cold glow that seemed to drift rather than walk, that appeared and disappeared without pattern or logic. They called it the Lantern Man, and the men who followed it did not return. St. Vith was a market town of perhaps 3,000 souls before the war, situated at a critical road junction where 7 highways converged. Control of St. Vith meant control of movement through the northern Ardennes, and both sides knew it. When the German offensive struck on the 16th, American forces fell back toward the town, establishing a defensive perimeter that would hold for 5 days against overwhelming enemy pressure. The 7th Armored Division, the 106th Infantry Division's remnants, and scattered engineer and artillery units dug in around the town and prepared to fight. The defense of St. Vith was desperate from the beginning. German armor probed the perimeter constantly, searching for weak points. Artillery fell day and night. The weather closed in on the 17th, bringing heavy snow and fog that grounded Allied aircraft and reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. Ammunition ran low, casualties mounted. The men held their positions because there was nowhere else to go. It was during this siege that the reports began to accumulate. Soldiers on the perimeter, exhausted and freezing in their foxholes, reported seeing lights moving in the forest beyond the American lines. Not flares, not vehicle headlights. Single points of pale illumination that drifted through the trees, visible for minutes at a time before vanishing. The lights appeared most frequently at night, but some men claimed to have seen them during the day as well, faint and ghostly against the snow. Lieutenant James Keller, commanding a platoon from the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, noted the phenomenon in his field journal on the evening of December 17th. He wrote that his men had been seeing the lights since the previous night, and that morale was beginning to suffer. Several soldiers refused to leave their positions after dark, claiming they had seen figures moving in the forest, not German soldiers, but something else. Keller dismissed these reports as stress and exhaustion, but he also noted that 3 men from his platoon had disappeared during the night of the 16th. They had been on sentry duty at the edge of the perimeter. When they failed to report in, a squad was sent to find them. Their foxhole was empty, their weapons were gone, but their helmets and personal equipment remained, arranged neatly at the bottom of the position. On the 18th, a similar incident occurred in another sector of the perimeter. 2 engineers from the 168th Engineer Combat Battalion, assigned to maintain a roadblock on the eastern approach to the town, vanished during a shift change. One moment they were visible at their post, the next they were gone. A search conducted at dawn found their rifles leaning against a tree trunk, the barrels pointed toward the forest. Fresh boot prints led away from the position, heading east into German-held territory. The prints showed no signs of struggle, no indication of running or stumbling. They simply walked away. The pattern repeated throughout the siege. Men disappeared from sentry posts, from supply runs, from positions along the perimeter. Sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. Always at night or during periods of heavy fog. Always leaving their weapons behind, arranged carefully, deliberately. The disappearances were attributed to German infiltration teams, to confusion in the chaos of combat, to soldiers breaking under the strain and deserting. But the men who remained spoke quietly among themselves, and what they spoke of was the light. Corporal David Marsh, a medic attached to the 23rd Armored Infantry Battalion, treated several soldiers for what he described in his notes as acute anxiety and dissociative behavior. The men were coherent, functional, but deeply shaken. They described seeing the light in the forest, hearing something that was not quite sound, but that resonated in their chests, in their bones. They said the light moved with purpose, that it seemed to be searching. And they said that when it found someone, when it settled on a man, that man would stand and walk toward it, no matter what anyone said or did to stop him. Marsh reported these accounts to the battalion surgeon, Captain Robert Hayes. Hayes examined the men and found no physical injuries, no evidence of concussion or neurological damage. He prescribed sedatives and recommended they be evacuated to the rear for psychiatric evaluation. But evacuation was impossible. The roads were cut. The perimeter was surrounded. The men stayed, and the lights continued to appear. On the night of December 19th, Lieutenant Keller witnessed the phenomenon himself. He was inspecting his platoon's positions along the northern edge of the perimeter when he saw it. A pale glow moving through the trees approximately 200 yards beyond the American lines. The light was steady, unwavering, and it moved horizontally, parallel to the ground, as if carried by someone walking. Keller watched it for several minutes. It did not flicker. It cast no shadows. And as he watched, he realized he could hear something. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation, a low-frequency vibration that he felt more than heard. He called to one of his men, Private First Class Leonard Torres, and asked if he saw the light. Torres confirmed he did. Keller ordered him to remain in position and moved closer to get a better view. He advanced 50 yards, using the trees for cover, keeping his rifle ready. The light continued to move, unhurried, steady, and then it stopped. Keller froze. The light hung motionless in the darkness, perhaps 150 yards away now. He could see it clearly. A sphere of pale luminescence, roughly the size of a basketball, suspended at chest height. No visible source, no beam. Just the light itself, glowing softly in the forest. Then it began to move toward him. Keller raised his rifle, sighting on the light. but he did not fire. Something stopped him. Not fear exactly, but a profound sense that firing would be worse than useless. The light advanced slowly, covering 10 yards, then 20, then 30. It made no sound. The snow beneath it showed no disturbance, and as it drew closer, Keller felt the vibration intensify, a pressure building in his skull, behind his eyes. He turned and ran. He crashed back through the trees, stumbling over roots and fallen branches, gasping in the frozen air. He reached his lines and did not stop until he was 20 yards behind the perimeter. Private Torres found him there, leaning against a tree, breathing hard. Torres asked what he had seen. Keller could not answer for several minutes. When he finally spoke, he said only that they needed to leave. They needed to abandon St. Vith and fall back. They needed to get out of the forest. Torres asked why. Keller said because something was in there with them, something that was not German, something that had been there long before the war and would remain long after. The order to evacuate St. Vith came on the evening of the 19th. The position was no longer tenable. German forces had nearly encircled the town, and continued defense would result in the destruction of all remaining American units. The survivors pulled out during the night, fighting through German blocking positions, abandoning equipment and supplies, moving west through the snow and darkness. Lieutenant Keller survived the withdrawal. He returned to his unit and continued to serve through the end of the war. But he never spoke of what he saw in the forest near St. Vith. When questioned by intelligence officers about German tactics and the circumstances of the siege, he provided factual, detailed responses. But when asked about the disappearances, about the lights, he said only that men were lost in the confusion of combat. Nothing more. Corporal Marsh also survived. He was evacuated in January 1945 after developing severe frostbite. In his final medical notes before leaving the theater, he wrote a brief addendum to his earlier reports. He noted that during the withdrawal from St. Vith, while moving through the forest in darkness, he had seen the light one final time. It had been ahead of the column, moving west, as if leading them. He wrote that several men had remarked on it, that they had followed it for nearly an hour before it disappeared, and he wrote that of the 200 men who began the withdrawal, 163 reached American lines. The others were never found. Bastogne became the focal point of the American defense in the Ardennes. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and scattered support units, held the town against repeated German assaults throughout late December. Supplies were dropped by air. Casualties were evacuated when possible. And in the midst of the siege, headquarters staff began compiling after-action reports from the units that had been overrun during the initial German offensive. It was during this compilation that patterns emerged. Missing personnel reports from multiple divisions showed an unusual trend. Across the entire front, over 200 American soldiers had disappeared without trace during the first week of the offensive. Not killed in action, not captured, simply gone. The circumstances were remarkably consistent. Men vanishing from sentry posts, patrols failing to return, individuals walking away from their units during night movements or periods of limited visibility. In nearly every case, personal equipment was left behind. Weapons were found abandoned but undamaged. Colonel Ernest Harmon, Deputy Chief of Staff for the First Army, noted the discrepancy on December 22nd while reviewing casualty figures at headquarters in Spa. The numbers did not align with expected patterns for soldiers killed by artillery, small arms, or armor. The missing personnel were too evenly distributed across multiple units, too dispersed geographically, and the circumstances of their disappearances were too similar to be coincidental. Harmon requested detailed reports from division and regimental intelligence officers. What he received over the following days troubled him. Multiple units reported sightings of unidentified lights in the forest. Sentries described figures moving through the trees that did not match German uniforms or equipment. Medical personnel noted instances of soldiers displaying dissociative behavior or extreme anxiety without apparent physical cause. And in at least 11 documented cases, soldiers had been observed walking toward the lights, ignoring orders to stop, moving as if compelled. On December 24th, Harmon convened a meeting with the 1st Army Intelligence Staff and 2 officers from the Counterintelligence Corps. The meeting was not recorded in official minutes, but several participants later referenced it in private correspondence. Harmon presented the data and asked for explanations. The intelligence officers had none. The CIC officers suggested the possibility of German psychological operations, perhaps sound equipment or some form of directed propaganda designed to induce panic or confusion. But no evidence of such equipment had been captured or observed. One of the CIC officers, a captain named Douglas Reeve, offered a different theory. Reeve had served in France in 1940 as a military attaché and had studied civilian accounts of the German invasion. He said that during the fighting in the Ardennes in May 1940, French and Belgian forces had reported similar phenomena: lights in the forest, soldiers disappearing, accounts from Belgian civilians that matched the folklore of the region. Reeve said the reports had been dismissed at the time as panic and confusion, but the consistency of the accounts had struck him even then. Harmon asked if Reeve thought the current incidents were related to the earlier reports. Reeve said he did not know, but he said the folklore of the Ardennes was specific and persistent. The locals called it l'homme à la lanterne, the lantern man. The stories claimed it appeared before battles, during times of violence, and that it took soldiers who had been marked for death. Whether that meant it caused death or simply predicted it, the stories did not make clear. The meeting ended without resolution. Harmon ordered that reports of unexplained disappearances be documented separately from standard casualty reports and flagged for further review. He also ordered that soldiers be briefed to remain in groups, to avoid isolated positions, and to report any unusual visual phenomena immediately. But he did not issue formal warnings about the lights. He did not want to create panic or undermine morale. On December 26th, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and relieved the garrison. Supplies poured in. The wounded were evacuated. And among those evacuated was a Belgian civilian, an elderly man named Emile Goffin, who had been trapped in the town during the siege and had worked as a translator for the American command. Goffin requested to speak with an intelligence officer before he was evacuated. He was taken to Captain Reeve. Goffin told him that the lights the soldiers had been seeing were not new. He said he had seen them himself as a boy during the First World War, when German and French armies fought through the same forests. He said his grandfather had told him stories of seeing the lights during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And his grandfather's grandfather had spoken of them during the Napoleonic campaigns. Reeve asked what the lights were. Goffin said no one knew, but he said the old people in the villages believed the forest remembered. He said the Ardennes had seen so much death over so many centuries that it had become saturated with it, that the violence had soaked into the soil and the trees. And he said that when men came to kill each other in the forest, something responded, something that had been there all along, waiting. Reeve asked if the lantern man was a spirit, a ghost. Goffin said no. He said it was older than that. He said it was the forest itself, or something that lived in the forest, and that it fed on the violence. He said it took the dying, or those who would die, and led them away. Where it led them, no one knew, but they never returned. Reeve documented the conversation in a report filed on December 27th. The report was classified and forwarded to First Army Intelligence. It was never acted upon. By late December, the German offensive had stalled. Allied reinforcements arrived. The weather cleared, allowing air support to resume. The momentum shifted. The lights continued to be reported sporadically through January, but with decreasing frequency as the fighting moved away from the deepest sections of the Ardennes forest. By February, the reports had stopped entirely. Colonel Harmon compiled a final summary of the missing personnel incidents on January 15, 1945. The total number of unexplained disappearances during the Battle of the Bulge was 237. Of those, 84 were later accounted for. Soldiers who had become separated from their units, been taken prisoner, or died of wounds in isolated locations. The remaining 153 were never found. No bodies, no graves, no prisoner of war records. Harmon's report noted the correlation with reports of visual phenomena, but offered no conclusions. He recommended that the cases remain under investigation and that relevant intelligence be shared with Belgian and Luxembourg authorities in case remains were discovered in the post-war period. No remains were ever discovered. The report was filed in the archives and forgotten. The soldiers who had witnessed the lights returned home, and most never spoke of what they had seen. A few mentioned it in letters, in private conversations with family, in the long, quiet hours of post-war nights when memory refused to stay buried. But the official record remained silent. And in the Ardennes, in the deep forest where the trails run old and the trees grow thick, the locals continued to tell their stories. They told them to their children, and their children told them to their grandchildren, and the stories remained the same. They spoke of the lantern man. They spoke of the light that moved through the trees. And they said that when the world came to the forest to make war, the forest took what it was owed. Private First Class Leonard Torres was evacuated to Liège on the 2nd of January with severe frostbite to both feet and symptoms of exposure. He had been with Lieutenant Keller's platoon during the defense of St. Vith and had participated in the withdrawal on the night of December 19th. The evacuation had taken him through multiple aid stations, each overwhelmed with casualties, before reaching the field hospital where proper treatment could be administered. Torres was coherent, responsive, and cooperative during his initial examination, but the attending physician, Major William Strauss, noted in his medical file that the patient displayed signs of acute psychological distress unrelated to his physical injuries. Torres was reluctant to sleep. He refused sedation, and he insisted on keeping a light burning beside his bed at all times, claiming he could not tolerate darkness. On the afternoon of January 3rd, Torres requested to speak with a chaplain. Captain Theodore Brennan, a Catholic priest serving as division chaplain for the 7th Armored Division, visited Torres at his bedside. What followed was documented by Brennan in a letter he wrote to his bishop several weeks later, a letter that would not be discovered until the 1980s, when Brennan's personal papers were donated to a seminary archive. Torres told Brennan he needed to confess something, but that it was not a sin in the traditional sense. He said he had witnessed something during the battle that he could not explain, something that had stayed with him every waking moment since. Brennan asked him to describe what he had seen. Torres said that on the night of the withdrawal from St. Vith, as his platoon moved through the forest in darkness, he had seen the light. It had appeared ahead of the column, moving west, and the men had followed it for nearly an hour. The light had not been bright, but it had been visible through the trees and the falling snow, steady and unwavering. Some men had remarked that it looked like a lantern. Others said it looked like the headlight of a motorcycle, except there was no sound, no engine, no tire tracks in the snow. Torres said he had been near the front of the column, close enough to see the light clearly. And as they walked, he had begun to notice something. The light was not alone. There were shapes around it, moving in parallel, keeping pace. He could not see them directly, but he could sense them. Figures that walked beside the light or followed it, forms that were there but not there, visible only in peripheral vision. He said that after following the light for perhaps 45 minutes, The column had entered a section of forest where the trees grew particularly dense. The light had moved ahead, deeper into the trees, and some of the men at the front of the column had continued to follow it while others held back. Torres had been among those who held back. He said he did not know why. Something had told him to stop. An instinct, a warning. The men who followed the light into the dense trees did not return. The column waited for 10 minutes, calling out, but there was no response. Lieutenant Keller ordered the remaining men to move on. They could not afford to wait. The Germans were close behind. Torres said that as the column continued west, he looked back once toward the dense trees where the light had gone. And in that moment, just before the forest swallowed the view, he saw something. The light was still there, deeper in the trees now, but it was not alone. Surrounding it were dozens of figures, human in shape but indistinct, translucent, like shadows cast by no source. They stood in a circle around the light, motionless, watching. And at the center of the circle, clearly visible despite the darkness, were the men who had followed. They were not moving. They were not struggling. They simply stood there, inside the circle, as if waiting. Then the trees blocked his view, and he saw nothing more. Torres told Brennan that he believed the light was not leading them to safety. He believed it was gathering them. He believed the figures around the light were the dead. The soldiers who had been lost in the forest over days and weeks and years and centuries. And he believed that the men who followed the light joined them. Brennan asked Torres if he thought the men were killed. Torres said no. He said they were taken somewhere else, somewhere that was not the forest and not the world, somewhere the light came from. Brennan asked if Torres had told anyone else about this. Torres said he had not. He said no one would believe him. He said he barely believed it himself, but he could not stop thinking about it. He could not stop seeing the figures standing in the circle, and he could not stop wondering if he would have joined them if he had kept walking. Brennan told Torres that what he had experienced was trauma, that the mind under extreme stress could create visions, hallucinations, false memories. He told him that the men who were lost had likely been killed by German fire, or had become separated in the darkness, or had succumbed to the cold. He told him that the light, if it existed at all, was probably a flare or a vehicle headlight, or some other mundane source distorted by exhaustion and fear. Torres listened politely. Then he said that Brennan was wrong. He said the light was real, the figures were real, and the men who followed were gone in a way that had nothing to do with bullets or cold. Brennan ended the conversation shortly after. He prayed with Torres, administered a blessing, and left. But the encounter troubled him. Over the following days, he made inquiries among the medical staff and spoke with other soldiers who had been evacuated from the Ardennes. Several reported similar experiences: lights in the forest, figures that were not quite visible, men who walked away and did not return. Brennan compiled his notes and considered submitting a formal report, but he did not. He later wrote in his letter to his bishop that he feared the report would be dismissed, or worse, that it would draw attention to soldiers who were already struggling with the psychological toll of combat. He said he chose to remain silent because he did not know what else to do. Torres recovered from his physical injuries and was transferred to a rehabilitation facility in France. He returned to duty in March 1945 and served through the end of the war in Europe. He was discharged in October 1945 and returned to his home in New Mexico. He married, raised a family, and worked as a mechanic for 40 years. He never spoke publicly about what he saw in the Ardennes. But in 1982, Torres was contacted by a researcher who had obtained his name from declassified casualty reports related to the Battle of the Bulge. The researcher, a graduate student studying unexplained incidents during the war, asked if Torres would be willing to discuss his experiences. Torres declined, but he did send the researcher a brief letter. In the letter, Torres wrote that he had spent 37 years trying to forget what he saw in the forest. He said he had been mostly successful, but he said that sometimes, on winter nights when the air was cold and still, he would see lights moving in the distance. Not headlights, not stars, something else. And when he saw them, he would go inside and turn on every light in the house and wait for morning. He wrote that he did not know what the Lantern Man was. He did not know where it came from or why it appeared, but he knew it was not human, and he knew it was still there, in the forest, waiting for the next time men came to kill each other in the dark. The letter concluded with a single sentence: "Do not go looking for it. It will find you." The researcher filed the letter with other materials related to the project, but never published it. The project was never completed, and Torres never responded to further inquiries. The 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge brought veterans back to the Ardennes by the hundreds. They came with families, with tour groups, with fellow survivors to walk the ground where they had fought and to pay respects to those who had not returned. The Belgian and Luxembourg governments organized ceremonies. Memorials were dedicated, speeches were given, and the old soldiers, now in their 70s and 80s, stood in the cold December air and remembered. Among them was James Keller, the former lieutenant who had witnessed the light near St. Vith. Keller had not returned to Belgium since 1945. He had remained in the army after the war, served in Korea, and retired as a colonel in 1968. He had lived quietly in Virginia, worked as a consultant, and raised 3 children. He had never discussed the lights with anyone outside his immediate family, and even then only rarely, in vague terms that suggested uncertainty about his own memories. But the anniversary drew him back. He traveled to Belgium with his eldest daughter and spent 3 days visiting the battlefields, walking the forest trails, attending the ceremonies. On the afternoon of December 16th, he visited the American cemetery at Neuville-en-Condroz, where over 5,000 American soldiers killed during the Battle of the Bulge are buried. The cemetery sits on a hillside overlooking the Ardennes, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David stretching across manicured grass. Keller walked the rows alone, reading names, stopping occasionally at graves of men he had known. His daughter remained near the entrance, giving him space. The afternoon was overcast and cold, the temperature just above freezing. A light wind moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery, carrying the smell of wet leaves and earth. At approximately 1600 hours, Keller stopped at a grave in the 4th row. The marker belonged to Private First Class Robert Talbot, 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, killed in action. December 19, 1944. Talbot had been one of the men in Keller's platoon who had disappeared during the withdrawal from St. Vith. His body had never been recovered. The grave contained no remains. It was a memorial only. Keller stood there for several minutes. Then he heard something. Not a sound exactly, but a presence. A sensation that he was not alone. He turned and looked toward the tree line at the edge of the cemetery, perhaps 50 yards away. There was a light. It was faint in the gray afternoon, barely visible, but it was there. A pale glow among the trees, stationary, unwavering. Keller stared at it. His chest tightened. His hands began to shake. He hadn't seen that light in 50 years, but he recognized it instantly. He walked toward it. He did not decide to walk. He simply found himself moving, one foot in front of the other, crossing the grass between the graves and the tree line. The light remained fixed, waiting. As he drew closer, he could see it more clearly. It was not a lantern. It was not a flashlight. It was something else, something without source or explanation, a luminescence that existed independent of any flame or bulb. He reached the edge of the cemetery and stopped. The light was perhaps 20 feet away, just inside the tree line. And now he could see something else. Shapes. Figures standing in the shadows around the light. Human forms. Indistinct, but present. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood there, watching him. Keller's daughter called to him from the cemetery entrance. Her voice broke the moment. He turned, looked back toward her, then looked again toward the trees. The light was gone. The figures were gone. There was only the forest, gray and silent and empty. He walked back to his daughter. She asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He said he thought he had seen someone he knew, but he had been mistaken. They left the cemetery shortly after and returned to their hotel. That evening, Keller wrote a letter. He addressed it to no one in particular, simply dated it, and placed it in an envelope with instructions that it be opened only after his death. The letter remained sealed in his personal effects for 12 years. Keller died in 2006 at the age of 84. His daughter discovered the letter while sorting through his papers and opened it. The letter was brief, handwritten on hotel stationery from the 1994 trip to Belgium. It read as follows: "I saw it again today. The light. The same one we saw at St. Vith. I thought after 50 years I might have imagined it. That memory had distorted what happened, but it was real. It is real. I do not know what it is. I do not know why it appears. But I know it is connected to the men we lost. I saw them standing around it. Not ghosts, not spirits. Something else. They were there, and they were waiting. I think they have been waiting all this time. I think they are still in the forest, wherever the light comes from, and I think that when I die, I will go there too. Not because I followed the light, but because I saw it, because it marked me. I do not fear this. I only want someone to know that what we reported was true. The men who disappeared did not run. They did not surrender. They were taken, and they are still there, in the forest, in the light. God help them. God help us all." The letter was read by his daughter and shared with two of his surviving children. None of them knew what to make of it. They assumed it was a product of age, of the emotions stirred by returning to the battlefield after so many years. They did not share it publicly. It remained in the family's possession, filed with other personal papers. But in 2008, the daughter attended a reunion of veterans from the 7th Armored Division. During the event, she mentioned her father's letter in passing to another veteran, a man who had also served during the Battle of the Bulge. The veteran listened quietly. Then he told her that her father was not the only one who had returned to Belgium and seen the light. He said that over the years, several veterans had reported similar experiences. Lights in the forest, figures among the trees, the sensation of being watched or called or marked. He said that no one spoke of it openly because no one wanted to be thought senile or delusional, but the reports existed, passed quietly among those who had been there, who had seen what they had seen and could not forget. Keller's daughter asked if the veteran had seen it himself. He said he had not, but he said he knew men who had. And he said that those men, without exception, spoke of the experience as if it were more real than anything else they had lived through. More real than the war. More real than the years that followed. He said the forest remembered. And what it remembered, it kept. Dr. Margot Rousseau was an anthropologist specializing in folklore and oral history in the Low Countries. Her research focused on the persistence of pre-Christian belief systems in rural communities and the ways traditional stories adapted to incorporate historical events. In 2002, she received a grant to document folklore related to the Ardennes forest, with particular attention to stories that had survived multiple generations. Her fieldwork took her to villages along the Belgian-Luxembourg border, where she interviewed elderly residents and recorded their accounts. What she found was a remarkable consistency. Nearly every community had stories about lights in the forest. The details varied. Some called it a lantern, others a torch or a will-o'-the-wisp, but the core elements remained constant. A light that moved with purpose, a figure associated with death or battle, and the warning that those who followed the light did not return. Rousseau initially approached these stories as pure folklore, symbolic representations of the dangers inherent in forest environments or metaphors for the uncertainty of war. But as she collected more accounts, she began to notice something unusual. The stories were not limited to ancient history. They included references to specific historical events: the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, the Second World War. And in each case, locals claimed the light had appeared before or during the fighting. In January 2003, Rousseau interviewed a man named Jean-Claude Beaumont, age 87, who lived in a farmhouse outside the village of Houffalize. Beaumont had been a boy during the Battle of the Bulge and had witnessed the fighting firsthand. He told Rousseau that on the night of December 16, 1944, he had seen lights moving through the forest near his family's farm. At first, he thought they were German vehicles, but as he watched from his window, he realized the lights were not on the roads. They were deep in the forest, moving between the trees, visible for minutes at a time before disappearing. His father had seen them too. His father had told him not to look, to stay away from the windows, to go to the cellar. His father had said the lights came when men were killing each other, and that anyone who went near them would be taken. Beaumont said he had not understood what that meant as a child, but later, after the war, when he learned that American soldiers had disappeared in the forest, not killed, not captured, simply gone, he understood. Rousseau asked if Beaumont believed the lights were supernatural. Beaumont said he did not know what they were, but he said they were real. He had seen them. His father had seen them, and his grandfather had told stories of seeing them during the First World War. He said the lights were part of the forest as much as the trees and the streams and the animals, and he said they appeared when the forest was disturbed by violence. Rousseau documented the interview and began cross-referencing Beaumont's account with historical records. She obtained declassified American military documents related to the Battle of the Bulge and discovered the reports filed by Colonel Harmon, January 1945. She found references to missing personnel, to unexplained disappearances, to soldiers walking away from their positions. She also found Captain Reeves' report documenting his conversation with Emil Goffin. The pattern was undeniable. The folklore aligned with the historical record. The lights had been reported across centuries, always in connection with warfare in the Ardennes, always with the same outcome. Rousseau expanded her research to include archival materials from the First World War. She discovered that French and Belgian military records from 1914 through 1918 contained scattered references to similar phenomena. Soldiers reporting lights in no man's land, men disappearing during night patrols, units experiencing unexplained casualties in sectors where no enemy activity had been observed. The reports were fragmentary, often dismissed as hallucinations or errors in record-keeping, but the descriptions matched those from the Second World War. She also found older references. Napoleonic campaign records mentioned lights seen by soldiers bivouacked in the Ardennes during the winter of 1794. A chronicle from the Duchy of Luxembourg, dated 1636, described mysterious fires in the forest during the 30 Years' War and soldiers who walked toward the fires and vanished. Even Roman sources, fragments preserved in medieval manuscripts, mention lights in the forests of Gaul that appeared during military campaigns. By June 2003, Rousseau had compiled over 200 documented instances spanning nearly 2,000 years. The geographic distribution was specific. Incidents occurred almost exclusively within the Ardennes forest, clustered in areas where major battles or prolonged military operations had taken place. The temporal distribution was equally specific. Incidents occurred during periods of active conflict, with few or no reports during peacetime. Rousseau proposed a theory. She suggested that the phenomenon was environmental, linked to the geology or hydrology of the region in ways that remained scientifically unexplored. She hypothesized that certain atmospheric conditions, combined with the psychological stress of combat, might produce collective hallucinations or perceptual anomalies that soldiers interpreted as lights or figures. She acknowledged that this theory did not explain the disappearances, but she argued that the missing soldiers could be accounted for through conventional means: enemy action, friendly fire, exposure, desertion. She submitted her findings as a research paper to an academic journal specializing in European folklore. The paper was rejected. The reviewers noted that her evidence was compelling, but that her conclusions were speculative. One reviewer suggested she was conflating folklore with history, and that the military records did not constitute proof of a supernatural phenomenon. Rousseau revised the paper, removing references to historical military records and focusing solely on the folklore. The revised paper was accepted and published in 2004 under the title "The Lantern Man of the Ardennes: Persistence of Death, Omens in Belgian Folk Tradition." The paper received modest attention in academic circles, but was largely ignored outside the field of folklore studies. But the research caught the attention of someone else. In October 2004, Rousseau received an email from a man identifying himself as a retired U.S. Army officer. He said he had read her paper and wanted to speak with her about her research. He said he had information that might be relevant to her work, but that he preferred to discuss it in person. Rousseau agreed to meet him. They met at a cafe in Liège in early November. The man was in his 80s, well-dressed, articulate. He did not give his name. He said he had been an intelligence officer during the Second World War and had been stationed in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. He said he had been involved in compiling reports of missing personnel and had read accounts from soldiers who claimed to have seen lights in the forest. He told Rousseau that the phenomenon was real. He said the lights were not hallucinations, not folklore, not misidentified flares or vehicles. He said they were something else, something that existed in the forest and responded to violence. He said the military had investigated the incidents briefly, but had abandoned the effort when no conventional explanation could be found. He said the records were classified, or had been destroyed, or had simply been forgotten. Rousseau asked why he was telling her this. He said because someone should know. He said the war was over. The men who had seen the lights were dying, and soon there would be no one left who remembered. He said that if the lights appeared again, if another war came to the Ardennes, no one would be prepared. No one would understand. He gave her a folder containing photocopies of documents, casualty reports, intelligence summaries, excerpts from unit histories. He said the documents were originals he had kept from his service, copies made before the files were sealed. He said she could use them however she saw fit, but that she should be careful. He said there were people who preferred these incidents remain unknown. Rousseau never saw him again. She attempted to contact him using the email address he had provided, but the address no longer worked. She had no name, no way to verify his identity. But the documents were genuine. She confirmed their authenticity through cross-reference with declassified materials in the National Archives. She incorporated the documents into her research, but did not publish them. She feared the implications, feared being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or sensationalist. Instead, she filed them in her personal archive and continued her work on other projects. But in 2011, Rousseau gave a lecture at the University of Liège on folklore and historical trauma. During the question period, a student asked if she still believed the Lantern Man stories were merely symbolic. Rousseau paused. Then she said she did not know. She said the line between folklore and history was not as clear as academics preferred to believe. And she said that sometimes stories persisted because they were true. The Ardennes remains. The trees have grown back where they were shattered by artillery. The roads have been paved. The village is rebuilt. 80 years have passed since the Battle of the Bulge, and the forest has absorbed the war, covered its scars, reclaimed the ground. Tourists walk the trails now. Hikers, cyclists, school groups visiting the monuments and museums. The forest is peaceful, protected, a place for recreation and remembrance. But the locals still tell the stories. In the villages along the forest's edge, in the farmhouses scattered across the hills, the old warnings persist. Do not walk the forest trails alone at night. Do not follow lights you cannot explain. Do not stray from the marked paths during the winter months when the darkness comes early and the mist settles between the trees. The younger generations dismiss these warnings as superstition, remnants of a rural past that has no place in the modern world. But the older residents know better. They remember the stories their parents told and their grandparents before them. They know the forest has a memory, and they know that what sleeps there is not gone. It is only waiting. In December 2019, a Belgian military training exercise was conducted in the Ardennes near the town of Bastogne. 200 soldiers participated in a week-long field exercise designed to simulate winter combat operations. On the night of December 16th, the 75th anniversary of the German offensive, a squad of 6 soldiers became separated from the main body during a night navigation exercise. The squad was equipped with GPS, radios, and standard cold weather gear. The weather was clear, temperature near freezing, visibility good. The squad's last radio check-in occurred at 21:45 hours. They reported their position accurately and stated they were proceeding to the designated rally point. Estimated time of arrival was 30 minutes. They never arrived. A search was initiated at 2300 hours when the squad failed to report. Search teams combed the area throughout the night. At dawn, helicopters with thermal imaging equipment joined the search. The squad's route was clearly marked on their maps. The terrain was familiar to the training cadre. There was no reason for the soldiers to become lost. At 1400 hours on December 17th, 5 of the 6 soldiers were found. They were located approximately 2 miles from their last known position, sitting in a clearing, uninjured, conscious, but unresponsive. They did not speak. They did not react to commands. Medical personnel were called in. The soldiers were examined and found to be physically healthy, showing no signs of hypothermia, injury, or drug intoxication. They were evacuated to a military hospital in Brussels. Over the following 48 hours, they gradually became responsive. When questioned, none could account for the missing time. They remembered beginning the navigation exercise. They remembered walking through the forest, and then they remembered nothing until they were found in the clearing. 12 hours were simply gone. The 6th soldier was never found. His equipment was discovered in the same clearing where the others had been located. His rifle, pack, and uniform were arranged neatly on the ground, as if he had removed them carefully and set them down. But there was no sign of the soldier himself, no tracks leading away from the clearing, no indication of struggle or flight. The incident was investigated by military police. No evidence of foul play was found, no enemy activity, no criminal conduct. The official conclusion was that the soldier had deserted, though no motive could be established and no subsequent trace of him was ever found. The 5 soldiers who were recovered were evaluated by psychiatrists and diagnosed with dissociative amnesia brought on by stress and disorientation. They were returned to duty after a brief period of observation. None of the soldiers involved ever spoke publicly about the incident, but one of them, a corporal named Mathis Dubois, mentioned it years later to his father. He said that before the gap in his memory, before everything went blank, he remembered seeing a light in the forest. He said it had been moving between the trees and that the squad had followed it, thinking it was another unit or a signal or something they were supposed to find. He said the light had been strange, too steady, too pale, too bright for a flashlight, but not bright enough to illuminate anything around it. He said he remembered walking toward it, and then he remembered waking up in the clearing with no sense of how he got there or how much time had passed. His father asked what he thought the light was. Dubois said he did not know, but he said he had spoken to one of the other soldiers afterward, quietly, and that soldier had seen the same thing. And that soldier had said he thought they were lucky that they woke up at all. The incident was never reported in the press. The military file was classified for reasons of operational security, and the forest closed over the mystery, as it has closed over so many others. Dr. Margot Rousseau died in 2021 at the age of 73. Her personal archive, including the documents given to her by the unnamed intelligence officer, was donated to the University of Liège. The materials were cataloged and made available to researchers in 2023. To date, they have been accessed by fewer than a dozen people, but among those who have reviewed the materials, a quiet consensus has emerged. The phenomenon documented in the Ardennes is real. It has persisted across centuries. It is linked to violence, to warfare, to the spilling of blood in the forest, and it remains active. What it is, no one can say with certainty. Whether it is a natural phenomenon that science has yet to explain, or something older and stranger, something that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear, remains an open question. The evidence suggests that it responds to human presence, that it is drawn to conflict, and that it takes those who encounter it to a place from which they do not return. The forest remembers. Every battle fought beneath its canopy. Every soldier who died in its shadow. Every patrol that disappeared into the trees and never came back. The memory is layered, sedimentary, compressed into the soil and the roots and the slow turning of seasons. And when violence returns, when men come again to the forest with weapons and fear and the intent to kill, the memory awakens. The lantern man appears. The light moves through the trees, and soldiers follow, one by one, into the dark. The warnings remain in the villages. The stories are still told. And those who know the forest, who have lived beside it for generations, continue to watch the tree line on winter nights when the mist rises and the darkness deepens. They know what is there. They know it has always been there. And they know it is waiting. Not for war, not for armies. Simply waiting in the way that old things wait, patient and inevitable, for the next time the forest is disturbed, for the next time the light is needed, for the next time men must be led away. The forest does not judge. It does not hate. It does not hunger. It simply is. And it takes what it is given. In December 2024, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge was commemorated across Belgium and Luxembourg. Veterans, historians, and dignitaries gathered at memorials. Ceremonies were held. Speeches were given, and in the Ardennes, in the deep forest, where the trails run old and the trees grow thick, the locals stayed home after dark. They closed their shutters. They kept their lights burning. And they told their children the old stories, the same stories their grandparents had told them. Stories of a light that moves through the trees, stories of soldiers who follow and do not return, stories of a forest that remembers and a figure that walks, lantern in hand, through centuries of darkness. The lantern, man of the Ardennes, still there, still waiting, still leading the lost into the spaces between the world and whatever lies beyond.